Hey everybody, Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm standing inside of Fort Gaines, which is a really cool fort down here on Dauphin Island. We are at the mouth of Mobile Bay. Mobile, Alabama is 30 miles as the crows flies to the north of us, but we are down here at the mouth of the bay visiting one of the three forts that would have protected Mobile Bay during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The most famous fort is probably Fort Morgan, which we'll check out in another video, which is 3 miles off to the east of us, sitting out at Mobile Point. We're over here on Dauphin Island. This will be Fort Gaines, and then we have a third fort which will be up in a pass near Mississippi Sound that would lead into Mobile Bay, a fort that's called Fort Powell, and it will protect a place called Grants Pass. We'll put a map up there so you have an idea of where we are. But Fort Gaines is really cool, and to make a very long story short, this fort comes about around 1821. But it takes until the opening of the Civil War for the Army to almost finish the construction of this fort. They start to build it here on the tip of Dauphin Island, also known to the French as Massacre Island when they come here in the early 1700s, because the Native Americans had large bone piles around here. Most likely they were animal bones and things, but the French saw these things, they call it Massacre Island, and when they start to inhabit the Mobile area, the French, they can't figure out why nobody wants to come here. Well, Massacre Island, so they changed the name to Dauphin Island. So it's a great place to be. We're right on the tip of it, but this is where Fort Gaines is going to sit. And you might be able to hear in the background the lapping of the Gulf of Mexico. You might also hear Mobile Bay, and we're going to go up on top of the ramparts of this fort so you can take a look at it. But down where we're standing, we have problems when we start to build this fort. That is that the Army Corps of Engineers is relatively new. And we have the problem that they're still kind of learning their jobs. And Joseph Totten, who's designed this fort, actually put it in a terrible spot. This parade ground that we're standing inside of would flood, and then the walls themselves would have problems as they're trying to construct this fort. So it will take a long time for this fort to be constructed. In fact, at one point there's a land dispute if the federal government even owns this piece of property. So by 1850s, Fort Gaines is finally getting back under construction, and it will be one of the 3 fortifications that will be down here to protect Mobile Bay. Fast forward to January of 1861, Alabama is on the verge of secession, and they are going to start making military operations. Governor Andrew Moore will start sending troops all around this area. Some of the troops will go out towards Pensacola, and in fact up to the Florida-Alabama line. Pensacola is an hour by car just on the other side of us to the east. Then we will have those troops try to take Fort Morgan, which we'll talk about. Then we'll have Fort Gaines fall to Confederate troops, and then Fort Powell as well, which is actually a renamed fort. But up here, this would be Fort Gaines. It's a masonry fort, meaning that it's made out of brick. It is basically 5-sided. The side behind Garry Adelman, who's behind the camera there, that's actually a flat area. That wall, which is 22 feet high with a moat around it, which is 35 feet wide, is going to protect from a landward incursion, which will come in August of 1864. But out in this direction, the more important job of this fort is to protect Mobile Bay and its entrance. So let's take a walk down this way, and Gary, be careful. As we walk down through here, we'll notice an exterior wall here. This will help to protect the gunners. I'm going to step up here just for a moment. This exterior wall has actually been hit by a shell from the USS Chickasaw, which would fire down into this area during the Battle of Mobile Bay in August of 1864, August 5th, 1864. But this wall here, this zigzag wall, is kind of interesting. This zigzag wall that I'm in behind is actually going to protect the gunners for the cannons that are in what's called barbette. Meaning that it will fire over the top of these fortifications. All of this tops of these fortifications, if you go to Fort Sumter when it used to have 3 tiers, or if you go over to Fort Morgan, Fort McHenry, other places, the top or the parapet of these forts will actually have earth on top of them for 2 reasons. Number one, that'll absorb the heat, especially down here in the sun. But number 2, it will also absorb shells if they come firing into this area and act as a natural bomb proof. But this wall is placed here, zigzagged formation, in case of a landward incursion, and this will help to protect the gunners who are manning these cannon, which will be firing off towards the Gulf of Mexico, and then of course out towards Mobile Point and then off towards Mobile Bay. So this is a really cool place. If you ever get a chance to come down to Fort Gaines, we're on the tip of Dauphin Island. They in fact will come out here, they'll fire one of the cannons from time to time. When we were here for our Teacher Institute in 2022, we had the opportunity to see one of those firing demonstrations. They actually have, and I didn't talk about it, this is bad interpretation on my part, they have one of the anchors of the USS Hartford, which was the flagship of David Glasgow Farragut, who was going to lead the U.S. fleet here into Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864. In fact, the USS Hartford existed up until 1956 when it finally just collapsed in and upon itself. So you'll find pieces of the Hartford at different places, and here at Fort Gaines you can actually touch one of those anchors of the USS Hartford. Fort Gaines itself in 1864 will play a minor role in the Battle of Mobile Bay. In fact, about 10 miles down Dauphin Island will land Gordon Granger, a United States graduate of the United States Military Academy, New York native. He's going to come out here. You might know him if you're a Chickamauga person. He commanded the Reserve Corps at Chickamauga. Gordon Granger will land troops, including United States colored troops, and start moving in on the landward side. Meantime, the Federal fleet will start amassing off into Mobile Bay, and they will start to run the guns of Fort Gaines, but more specifically Fort Morgan, on August 5th of 1864. And I'm been talking a little bit here. I think Kris Mackowski might have something he wants to jump in with, but this is an awesome view looking out towards Fort Morgan, which is the sister fort here to Fort Gaines. Fort Morgan's completed in 1834, named after Daniel Morgan, and we'll visit that fort in a little while.
The defenses of the bay were actually set up with torpedoes out in the channel, some 76 of them, not necessarily to block the traffic, but to funnel the traffic over closer to Fort Morgan. That allowed this fort, Fort Gaines, to then bombard any ships that might be trying to run that gauntlet. But when Granger's men move up the island in this direction, they discover that this fort is vulnerable from the land side. And so as these artillery pieces here, some 26 cannon that are stationed here, begin firing off in that direction as Farragut moves up into the bay, Granger sees that soft spot. He's able to move his own artillery into place using the sand dunes for cover, allowing him to get really close. And he actually takes out 2 of the guns that are here as a result. And that's going to then soften this fort up, and they're going to be able to hold out just for a couple days. The battle itself out in the bay lasts for about 3 hours. The siege here lasts for a couple days, but Granger's finally going to be able to capture this fort. There are about 600 guys in this garrison compared to about 1,500 guys that Granger brings with him. He's got 3 regiments, guys from Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio, plus he's got a volunteer cavalry unit from Maryland, and so that's what's going to invest this fort. When the fort falls, they're going to hop on some boats, go across the bay to Fort Morgan, and then begin a siege there. We'll talk more about that in a separate video. So when you come here today, you can see the remains of that fight. And as Kris has pointed out, a lot of the fortifications that are here. Just some fantastic spots that you can see out into the bay from where we're standing. We're going to hop up here onto the parapets for just a moment, and we look back down into the parade ground, and you can see the anchor that Kris started out the video next to. We've got off to the left in that direction, we can see the officers' quarters. They used to be 3 stories tall, but during the battle, the couple top stories were knocked off by cannonballs, and so that's why that building is shorter. Across the way, we can see the guardhouse, which is today where people come through as they enter into the facility. Off to the right, we can see some buildings that are built into the side of the fort. There was a bakery over there, there was a blacksmith shop, and there was a spot that leads to one of the most important places in the whole fort, the latrines. We've also got a quartermaster's place over here. We've got artillery magazines, and we can see the remains of more modern fortifications here. Right next to us, we have a well for what was known as a disappearing gun, because it was spring-loaded, and it would fire and then sink back down, so it would be protected from any counter-battery fire out there. So, you know, a fantastic resource that you could come out here and explore, and they're just such great friends of the Trust. Let me bring Kris back on to talk a little bit about that partnership that you guys have with Fort Gaines.
Yeah, Fort Gaines is great. Melinda, we really appreciate her having us out here. And if you ever get a chance, be sure to explore out here. So you're going to see concrete up here. This is part of the Endicott system. This is a fortification placed here right before the Spanish-American War, 1894, 1895. Inside of this, as Kris said, there would be a disappearing gun. Those are also known as peekaboo guns, because what would happen is you would bring it up to fire, and the recoil would actually push it right back down in. It's a 12-inch gun that would fire up to 8.5 miles. 268 pounds of black powder will fire a 1,047 pound projectile out to sea to try to take out any sort of ships. So it's very impressive, but it was not here during the American Civil War. What was here were 26 cannon, and including infantry, probably as much as 600 under the command of Charles Anderson. Anderson, who's in charge up here, also is in communication with Fort Powell. The commander up at Fort Powell is saying, like, man, there are boats coming at us, there's Yankees coming at us, this place is getting really hot, what should I do? And Anderson says, hold out the best you can, and if you don't think you can hold out, save your garrison. And that's all that commander had to hear. He left 2 guys behind, said spike the guns and blow up the fort, and that's what they do. The local commander in the area, Dabney Maury, will actually try to court-martial that commander, who it gets off exonerated because they're like, yeah, there's nothing this guy could do there. But the commander here, Anderson, will end up having to surrender Fort Gaines a few days after the federal fleet moves its way in to Mobile Bay, fights with Fort Morgan, fights with ships like the Selma, the Tennessee, the Gaines, and the Morgan. Those are also ships, just to confuse you out here. And that will be the Battle of Fort Morgan, which we'll talk about in another video. Gary, looks like you want to...
Yeah, I have a couple things. Hello, everybody. Kris was talking about how, it seemed like this was going to happen anyway. Fort Powell was going to fall. Fort Gaines was going to fall. And that is because of the massive Union force that the Confederates are going to have to confront here, wherever they are, whether it be out at Fort Blakely and Spanish Fort, whether it be at Fort Morgan, whether it be at Fort Powell or here. They're going to be facing an overwhelming Union force, usually outnumbering them in infantry 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 to 1. And having bigger and better guns, and those guns have longer ranges as well. So there's only so much they can do at this point. I was trying to find it right while we were walking around, but if you read Dabney Maury's reports, and yes, you can read the official reports of the soldiers who were actually at these places. If you read Dabney Maury's, it is the most matter-of-fact report I've ever seen. Fort Powell fell, Fort Gaines fell, they ran into Mobile Bay. It is a very matter-of-fact, and it almost seems like he's angry at this point. Kris?
Yeah, I just want to flip around real fast, and then we're going to take a look at the rest of the fort. But across the way, this is the mouth of Mobile Bay. The next piece of land you might see in the distance, that's Mobile Point. That's where Fort Morgan sits. That's 3 miles from us. To get out there today, you can take a boat, or if you're in a car, you can take a ferry across. There's a toll ferry that will take you across there. It's a really neat ride to go between Dauphin Island as well as Fort Morgan. Now, Dauphin Island's important to the city of Mobile Bay because this is a very narrow channel. Come on, folks, we got to keep moving.
Yeah.
It's a very narrow channel in Mobile Bay, and the bar that you would have to go over, especially in the 18th century, the 1700s, it became very difficult to get ships. So you'd have to have small, basically lifter ships or tender ships to come down here. You could offload your cargo out in the bay onto these smaller ships that have a lower draft or lesser tonnage. That means they won't sink as far in the water. And you could take them over the bar, put them in larger ships, and take them the next 30 miles up into Mobile Bay, up to Mobile, Alabama itself. So this is a very important area. This is where you would have many of the supplies that would come through here in the 1700s whenever we have this as a French colony. Then it's a British colony. Then it's a Spanish colony. Then the Americans show up in 1813 and say, we're annexing this in the name of the United States, and that's how we'll get Alabama. Eventually, Mobile is the city under 6 different flags, including the Republic of Alabama and the Confederacy. So it's a really cool place to visit, and most people think the Battle of Mobile Bay is up at the city. The city itself, 30 miles away, it's not even the primary objective of the United States Navy and the Army when they come here in August of 1864. Their goal, cut off the mouth of the bay. That cuts off all of the blockade runners, those ships that were trying to run through the Union blockade of ships, and that will seal off the bay, and the rest of it doesn't really matter. In fact, Mobile doesn't fall until April 12th of 1865. This battle was fought on August 5th, 1864. So just a few days after Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox, the city of Mobile falls.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying there too, Kris, because here you have this battle in August of 1864, all these operations, and some of the same people, as Kris Mackowski mentioned, that were at Fort Gaines here were also taking Fort Morgan. And what do you know, when you look to them at Fort Blakely and Spanish Fort, some of those same troops are there. You can go the other direction as well. These same troops are at Shiloh. These same troops are in all of the major campaigns that you know of, especially in the Western Theater. So it's really important to not just look at this in a vacuum. We have to look at this as the whole event, that these soldiers, these are the same people in the same units fighting throughout the Civil War, and this is why it can be a life's work. Is really, you know, trying to study and wrap your brain around it. In the end, you know, a lot of these things work in a linear fashion. Once you follow Granger down from Dauphin Island to Fort Morgan and then over to Fort Blakely and see who the other commanders are, things start to fall into place. So don't give up if this stuff sounds confusing. You can just hop on battlefields.org and, you know, check out one of our map books and get a little bit of better grasp of it. Chris?
Yeah, because Mobile actually plays a role in the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, as well as the Civil War, the three wars that the American Battlefield Trust actually covers. So if you want to learn more, as Garry pointed out, go to battlefields.org. Head over to Fort Gaines's website. You can learn how to visit down here. It's a really cool place to come down and visit. And we're going to go and visit, as Kris pointed out, Kris Mackowski, the most important room in any fort, and that is going to be the latrines.
And by the way, I'm already starting to see some requests. No, who are you people? We're not going to demonstrate how they were used at the time. I think that's a little bit too far.
So what's interesting about this fort, and what we're seeing here as we walk up, giving Kris a workout, what we're seeing here is behind me are the latrines. As we walk around here, simply, all they are open air toilets, the latrines, that you would do your business, and it would go right down into the exterior moat of the fort. So think about if you're a Union soldier who has to charge across through the moat, what could be in there is human excrement. And what's supposed to wash it out every day is actually the moat is attached to the Gulf. So high tide would come up and fill it with water, and low tide would flush it out for you. But the interesting piece that you have here is that this was part of the wall defensive line. You can see the firing slits to fire out of with small arms, with rifles, muskets, things like that. So somebody had to defend this position. Think about defending the bathrooms. They had opened this up so you can move up and down the wall. But if you notice over here, they've actually sealed it off. So this was actually one part of the fort, and eventually they realized they needed latrines, and this is how they set up these latrines over here. And this is a very important place, especially out here being stuck on an island. I want you to think about this. You're 30 miles away. You don't have a car. You don't really have a boat. You're on an island, a barrier island nonetheless. What you're going to deal with as a soldier, and some of our soldiers dealt with this in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, sand fleas. Whenever soldiers were asking during the height of the Afghani and Iraqi wars, they're asking for flea collars to put around their ankles because they had fleas. There's sand fleas out here. Sand blindness is a real thing. Some people might say, why are you wearing sunglasses? In fact, Civil War soldiers had forms of sunglasses that they would wear because it was so blinding out here. And then they would also deal with the problem of a lack of water. How do you deal with that? We have cisterns that are out here, which would collect rainwater not only from straight out of the sky, but out of the gutters of this place. It would go down through a cistern system that was actually filtered using seashells and sand, and that would clean your water for you. So the lack of water, lack of supplies could be a problem because you're out here on this barrier island. This is a very isolated post, and these men who are going to be dealing with not just boredom, but dealing with Mother Nature and the elements stuck out here on a barrier island. Looks beautiful to visit, and it is. It's a great place to come. It's not a place I probably want to stay.
Yeah, this is really interesting, you know, and I think, are we going to make our way back out to the parade ground?
Unless you need to use the facilities, Garry.
Yeah. I might hang out a little bit after this video, but I think it's really interesting, you know, coming here. You know, this is a third system fort, you know, which comes after the second system, which in itself came after the first. You know, but when you go to Fort Sumter, when you go to Fort Point, when you go to Fort Pulaski, what you find is some similarities, but a different experience at each one based upon the history that occurred there. That's why it's important to be able to come here, touch these places, see where the soldiers were, and see what they saw when Granger's command was coming this way, as they watched the battle for Mobile Bay, as Fort Morgan fell over there, and through the centuries of history that Kris described at the outset. Kris?
Yeah, and I want to, again, encourage you to come out here to Fort Gaines. Thank you to Melinda and everyone here, the staff at Fort Gaines. It's an awesome site. You can come out here, visit yourselves, bring your school groups out here. We brought our teachers out here earlier well, now it's 2023. In 2022, we brought them out here for our Teacher Institute. But when you walk out here, just check out the parade grounds. Think about 600 men being stationed out here in a fort of this size. It's not a large piece of property. It looks much larger probably on camera than it actually is in reality. And then think about the people who have to build these places. You have to bring all these materials down to this island, and the island will provide the bricks. You can create the bricks and the mortar down here, but people have to build those. Some of those will be government contractors. Some of those will be slaves that are actually leased from local plantation owners. This will be a big time construction project. So think of a government project today or a government contract. These were big businesses, these forts down here, creating Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, which we're going to go visit, which is the third most expensive third system fort in the entire system, of over $1 million it cost to build that thing. This was big business. And today, it's a different form of business, and that's tourism, history, or heritage tourism. So we hope that you'll get down here, check it out, climb up onto the ramparts, check out the guns, and check out the beautiful views of Mobile Bay, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. On behalf of Garry Adelman, Kris Mackowski, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.